Hello, this is Dr. Jean. Dear future people, today we are going to take things very slow and intentionally so. We are going to talk about thinking and philosophy. Well, we turned processing of information from the point of view of a system, input processing. Now we are going to talk more general. And we are going to term processing of information as thinking. Now, in our last presentation, we said that observation was a local process. It has local characteristics. But thinking is also local. More precisely, thinking is locally unique. And that's going to be our central theme today. So thinking is termed here, or defined here, as the unique processing of information. And we need to realize that much of the information, like we said in our last presentation, much of the information that we get is communicated. So we don't get most of our knowledge from direct observation. We get most of our knowledge through communication. So what is the role of thinking? Thinking is ordering, organizing, putting information into perspective, attributing a certain weight, significance, importance. And that is very relative and unique because it is relative to circumstances and conditions that we have locally, and significance is always relative to a given situation. So if we go one step further, then we are going to define philosophy as a more systematic organizing of information. So philosophy is putting things into perspective. Philosophy is ordering thought, but doing so in a more systematic manner, in a more consistent manner. In other words, when you engage in philosophy, then your thinking is going to get more attention. It's going to get more effort put into it. And so philosophy is going to be a very systematic approach to processing information. We said before that religion is defined as a community practice based on a community philosophy. Okay? So religion is a practice of philosophy, a practical form of philosophy. So now, back to thinking. We said that our central theme is that thinking is very highly specific and it's very locally unique. It is specific to the system in terms of its actual state, its integrated memories and emotions. So what you order and how you order it, what significance you're going to attribute to an information item is going to depend on the state of the system and the memory, the integrated memory of the system. In our last presentation, we said that any kind of observation, in other words, the way you gain knowledge is through observation and communication. And observation and communication gives you information that you are going to process. And that processing is going to be based on your prior knowledge, which is very local because it's based on life experience that is very local. And again, when I say you, I don't mean you as an individual. And let's talk about this a little bit more. So first of all, we just said that assigning weight significance is very specific to a system. And a system uses credibility, trust, okay, and attributes a certain degree of credibility and trust to every source. And that is also a local process because it's based on previous life experience for that particular individual or community. So even in science, even in mathematics, there is a lot of credibility, a lot of trust that one uses, okay, for information processing. So obviously there is a lot of credibility, okay, involved in this process that you see right here, okay. This child trusts this person, okay, and therefore this child is gonna be very highly influenced by information coming from this source. Well, if you look at this source of information, you might not be so sure. And believe me, as a practicing scientist, I know that a source of communication, not to mention forms of communication, is very important even in scientific communication. So in other words, there is very little in terms of standard. You have very essential differences in terms of your trust from a source. So a trusted source is very specific to the system with some common patterns. Now, let's see. We talked about source and credibility. Now we are going to talk about densities. Now, densities is an object of thinking that has a specific weight, significance attached to it. Now, look at this EKG pattern right here. And so let's say that you have a run of PVCs that is abnormal heartbeats. And then you notice that under certain circumstances, these runs of abnormal heartbeats or PVCs are going to be very important because they might predict under certain circumstances certain clinical outcomes, okay? So you, because of your prior experience under certain circumstances in a certain patient population, you attribute quite a lot of significance to a pattern like this because it might predict in a certain patient group under certain circumstances a very important outcome. So any pattern that you are sensitized to, you attribute significance to, is termed as densities. Now, the point is that densities are local because densities represent not just uniform experiences that any observers can have under any circumstances, but local observations that are very significant in that particular area, okay? So that these densities are very important for certain physicians, for example, cardiologists, to predict outcomes for certain patients. Now, and notice that this run of PVCs might be important for certain patients and might not be important for other patients, okay? So, relative to the system, relative to the thinking community or the thinking individual, certain things might be under certain circumstances, very important. So densities are always relative to a system. Now, we talked about source, how important it is that you interpret your source and you have some kind of credibility for a source. We talked about densities, how certain things are more important under certain circumstances. Now let's talk about the subject of thinking, in other words, who thinks. Well, we said that thinking is local, but local how? So now we are going to make a claim that throughout most of human history, thinking was community thinking. Okay? So it is a small community process. And when you have densities, that density is not relative to an individual or the whole society, but that density is relative to a small community. That source that you trust or trust less or more is specific to a small community. Okay? So, except for a very short period of time with urban lifestyle and individualism, most human history involved community as a basic unit for thinking. Okay? People were very close together, and this small community had very strong communication and very close communication, and so the thinking was a tribal thing, a small community thing. Okay. Now, in the last very short period of time, historically, thinking became more and more at an individual level. And that had a lot of consequences that we need to talk about. Now, there is yet another variable, and that is regression. So if you get sick, then your perspective is going to be more narrow, and your attention is going to be more on the individual. Okay? So that the regression is an influence that makes your perspective narrow and you focus more on the individual. But conversely, when you are very healthy, your perspective might be wider, okay? And your thinking is more gonna be involving a larger piece of reality around you, and that also involves the community. So the point here is that, as we mentioned in our last presentation, observation is not necessarily attributed, or may not need to be attributed, to an idealized individual observer. So thinking is also not by default individual thinking, except in our highly artificial urban environment, and we're going to talk about that. So thinking is community thinking. Our priorities, our densities, our information source, our thinking patterns, okay, are supposed to be based on a small community with similar life experience and close communication. Okay. So thinking is supposed to be local, unique, but not separate as an individual thinking. Thinking is supposed to be attached to a small community. Small community here, small community here, versus this very highly artificial form of information. And this is going to be extremely important for you, future people, to understand what went so extremely wrong in 2023? Because people are engaged, they practice in a philosophy that simply ignores this, okay? So they see that something is not right, but they don't know what is not right because people just simply do not consider very basic things that are consequential, okay? So one of the very basic things that is very consequential is that the natural ordering process, the natural thinking process, okay, is not done in a natural way. It's done in a very highly artificial way at an individual level. And the consequences of that are crucial. So, thinking as an individual process, from the individual perspective, in an urban environment, is dependent on a highly specialized form of communication that enable this type of an information processing form, okay? So, in other words, you have computers, you have standardized forms, you have certain community rules, okay, involving a lot of standardization and coordination based on that standardization. So, you immediately see here that when you have a shift from basic thinking unit, a community, to basic thinking unit, an individual, it's such an artificial shift that you need to support it by very specialized form of communication involving all kinds of standardization and all kinds of coordination based on standardization, not to mention indoctrination and propaganda. So a highly artificial, a highly unnatural form of thinking is maintained very actively, and there is a purpose in that, and that is manipulation and exploitation. But we talked about that before when we talked about parasitism. So now we have compensation for all of this, because as natural thinking becomes very highly artificial, there is a feeling of something not being right, okay? There is a feeling of absence, that something is absent that is very important. So what do? Like you do all the time when you have a problem, you don't see the complexity of the problem, and therefore you seek a simple solution, you compensate, okay? So compensation is a mechanism whereby you try to find a simplistic solution for a complex problem. So compensation here is secondary community thinking, not natural community thinking, but secondary community thinking. And that is based on interest groups. For example, you listen to a lecture, okay, based on common interests, say in physics or, I don't know, social economics or whatnot, okay? You worship and idolize a performer, okay, be it a rock star or whatever, okay? Or sports or whatever else, okay? So you have interest groups, and these interest groups compensate the lack of natural community thinking, okay? So the interest is, remember, a focus giving rise to artificial boundaries, okay? But also forming an interest group. In other words, you make an artificial thing called a community of people based on a special interest. But this is not a natural well-rounded, harmonious type of community. This is a very specialized and focused community, and that has its own consequences. So, let's talk about the consequences of this very highly artificially maintained, very unnatural thing called individual thinking. Okay? So, on the most basic level, and we already talked about it when we studied the nature of the mind, so on a very basic level, one of the consequences of individual thinking is that if you attribute an absolute association between thinking and the human individual, then you are going to make the individual a basic unit. This basic thinking unit is then attributed to a human physical body, and inside the human physical body, one physical organ called the brain. So when you consider thinking as individual, as a default, which is not true, then you get to the idea that thinking can be linked to a physical organ, an individual physical organ. And in that minute, you are going to get into a very highly artificial situation called mental atomism. Okay? So thinking is attributed to one single physical unit called the brain. Now, obviously, if you understand that thinking is really not supposed to be at an individual level, but it's supposed to be at a community level, okay? Then you have more of a tendency to understand that thinking is really not so much attributable to a physical unit, because a community is so much more than individual bodies. Community involves, at the very minimum, communication, okay? Which is not only verbal communication, but rituals, dance, common life patterns, life experiences, customs, etc., etc., okay? So you understand how much thinking is not physical, okay? How much thinking is above and beyond human bodies, and how much thinking is not unit thinking, okay? Because it transcends individual units, be it in a physical sense or whatever sense. And if you go one step further, and if you understand that thinking is also secondarily coordinated and standardized, and it's very unique, then you understand that thought panels, thought atoms, okay, called categories, okay, or algorithms, are also very highly artificial. And that is also something that can be transcended. So, again, human thinking at the level of a small community, the community is either perceived as a default with a common community, or you may think about it as a multitude, a network of separate individual brain units, ego units. That is the present day. So in other words, then obviously you are going to talk about neurons, okay? Because individual brains are also broken down into small units called neurons. And then you make secondarily, okay, kind of interest groups of neurons, and that is networks of neurons, okay? And you can make artificial networks also. But this is like extracting vitamin C from a very healthy fruit and then putting back vitamin C into some other food. It's a very highly artificial process. No. The default is not this. The default, the natural thing, okay, is not a neuron, a brain, a human individual, okay? The default is the community. The default is the organic unity of all thinking process, okay? And so what you understand here, that there are very unique local experiences, but those local experiences, those local thought processes are not separate at all, okay? And so you see that this is an organic unity, not something that is made up from individual units that are secondarily and artificially connected as an artificial network, which is highly standardized and coordinated. So, but this artificial and very unnatural worldview, this philosophy, okay, that we are addressing here, where does it come from? And what are its basic consequences? Well, lifestyle has a lot to do with it. In other words, when you are in a small community like this, living together, your perspective is going to be entirely different than if you are in a highly standardized and coordinated environment like this. So this is a very artificial environment, giving rise to very special, unique thoughts that are very specific to that kind of environment, experiences in that kind of environment. And the problem is that these kind of experiences are then secondarily generalized. And these kind of people living in this type of condition, okay, they believe that those experiences, those truths that are valid for them, are valid for everybody. And they totally ignore what happens outside of their usual patterns of living. That is the basic problem. So then let's go and continue this. One second. By saying that this type of thinking also manifests itself in terms of cooking, okay? So you have a more organic, more unique cooking process based on your local conditions, local ingredients that you might produce according to the local climate, the local quality of your soil. Versus you have this very highly artificial, standardized and coordination here comes from customs, from commercial advertisements, etc., okay, or propaganda, okay. This is a, national meal and everybody should eat that, okay. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that this represents the idea of a local community using locally available ingredients and cooking it or preparing it very uniquely, which is typical for that certain tribe or local community based on local circumstances and conditions. This, however, is a very highly homogeneous, uniform, coordinated, standardized, fixed pattern that, like cancer, is spreading everywhere. So notice that in a local community, these people have to work together, okay? And as they work together, they need to communicate very closely, and they need to think together, okay? So that they do this job, this work process, coordinated, but coordinated uniquely, okay? As they, in their local circumstances, need it, as is practical for them under local conditions. Now, look at this one here, okay? Yeah, this person is connected to a center, but that center is an abstract, distant, and uniform center, okay? And so thinking is not necessarily mutual, okay? Thinking is a very highly specialized process where this distant center gives you a task, and then you try to solve it using very common patterns that are standard and fixed, okay? So, you can also see that for community thinking, you need a lot of communication. And that communication is very highly idealistic, okay? Very highly spiritual, very highly transcendent of the material world. And that is the nature of communication in a small community. You need something that is above and beyond the individual. So the individual local uniqueness remains, but there is something that binds together all these individuals. Common life experience, a sense of working together, a sense of thinking together. Whereas in this very highly artificial environment, you have standard fixed patterns, so that this spirituality to a large extent is unnecessary, and because you have fixed patterns, then your perspective is going to be reduced to a small set of variables that you are going to consider, because you don't need anything else, okay? So you live on the basis of algorithms, because these are preset variables and a few number of variables that are specifically set for you as an individual. And so you tend to be more materialistic, because why? Because you can ignore that spirituality which would bind a local, unique, and organic community together, which is necessary for this bond. You don't need that bond. So you ignore spirituality and you go on focusing on a few preset variables. Now the funny thing is, and this is for you future people, that these people in 2023 boast that they are free, that they live in a free world, that they are, I don't know, some superior beings because of their freedom and their political institutions. Whereas you can see that there is no stronger form of slavery, exploitation than this. Because everything that is natural, everything that is organic, and everything that is unique is pressed, is forced into a few variables that are preset for them. So no wonder they have such crazy ideas as predetermination or predestination or determinism. Because, why is this? And they don't even notice how nonsensical these notions are. Why is this? It is because they are simply put into a box, okay? A box like this, a box like that, okay? They are put into this box, And they focus so much on a few preset variables that they don't even notice that it's bad being in a box, okay? And they call themselves free, which is totally laughable and ridiculous, okay? So that is why these people focus on material things, on practical things. That is why these people are realists, okay? Not because they are smart. No, they are not smart. That's the idea. Scientists, businessmen, these are not smart people. They are not intelligent. They follow certain preset, predetermined patterns, and they manipulate the variables a little, okay? But they have no idea that above and beyond their preset variables, there is a world of infinite abundance and complexity, okay? So they are not smart people. And so there is another aspect to this, and that is called instant gratification or short-term gratification. So when you are frankly lazy, not only in terms of lazy to do physical work, but lazy to think deeply, okay? Then you go the path of least resistance, okay? You see what's easy for you. And it is certainly easy to go to an urban center where you don't have to do hard work and you don't have to think because things are pre-digested for you. You have standard foods, you have uniform foods, you have uniform thought panels, you have categories that they measure you by, okay? And everything is pre-digested for you as if you were a baby, okay? And you even get baby formula, okay? So that you forget the natural abundance of potential nutrition, okay? So, but this instant short-term gratification, which is depicted here. In other words, this is the growth of rural population and this is the growth of urban population, has a price. Because unbalanced, unnatural things, which are based on a few variables, and you ignore every other variable, okay? So you think inorganically, okay? These kind of things are based on a philosophy of a parasite, a philosophy of a businessman, okay, which short-term produces great results, but on the long run, because you lose balance, because you are not well-rounded, okay, because you only consider a few variables, few very basic variables, okay, on the long run, it's bound to produce disaster. And so in the first 100 or 200 years, that disaster is not yet there, like in an adolescent who drinks a lot of alcohol or uses drugs, okay? You need a certain amount of time for the poisoning to manifest itself, okay? For example, from smoking, you get the possibility or propensity to develop cancer, but that takes time. So these extremely naive people, they believe, oh, but we produced great results. Yes, on the short run you did. But on the long run, you devastated your environment. Okay? Not because of one specific thing. You used fossil fuels or you used this or that type of chemicals. Not because of that. But it's because you lost touch with nature. Okay? And losing touch with nature means that you lost spirituality. You lost small community. Okay? You lost a trusted source of information. And your densities, your significance, significant things, okay, are all lost. And you have artificial densities. You have artificial imaginary centers, okay, that manipulate you. And that it is your lifestyle, your thinking, and now in 2023, where people believe that philosophy is dead, okay? They don't understand that this is based on a wrong philosophy, okay? a wrong philosophy of materialism and atomism, a wrong philosophy where science is oversimplified, okay? And because it is oversimplified, it doesn't see a multi-dimensional matrix that reality really is. It picks out a few variables and operates only with them. And it fixes circumstances and conditions and believes that the natural state of affairs is when you fix all variables except the 2 or 3 that you are interested in. And you call that force or gravitation, or you call that, I don't know, neurotransmitters or whatever, whatnot. Okay? So basically the problem here is posi-dimensional thinking. So in other words, you consider only a few variables and you ignore all other variables. And notice that this whole process is so much easier if your thinking is mainly at an individual level. Because the more your thinking is at a communal level, the more you see the variety, the abundance of not only your physical environment, but also your human, your living environment, okay? And the more variation you see, the more you understand that you need to consider more variables to explain that variation. And your oversimplistic I fix all conditions, I fix all circumstances, I only consider this and that variables. Like, for example, money is a variable here, okay? That is becoming the overwhelming motivation for you. And then you end up with this, sooner or later. Not because of fossil fuels, not because of antidepressants, but because of your philosophy, okay? So then, metabolic syndrome, eating pre-digested industrial food that is coordinated, okay? That is, it's the same food here as in the other end of the world, okay? So no matter how different you are from a person living in the other side of the world, you eat the same food. You wear the same clothes because you follow pre-digested, preset patterns. You follow algorithms, okay? You follow thought panels called categories. And you follow a few preset variables. So you end up with metabolic disease, metabolic syndromes, hormonal problems. And it is no chance that you have something like the brain-gut axis, because what you eat will change your gut flora, your microbiome, okay? And that is going to be directly consequential to your mood in the brain. And this is a scientific fact that has been proven by science. There is something like the brain-gut axis, and mood disorders are especially sensitive to this brain-gut axis functionality, okay? And in general, you have lack of balance. Why do you get lack of balance? Why you have destroyed your own harmony? It's not because of one problem or another. And it's not what 2023 people think, that, okay, there's this criminal organization and we blame everything on this criminal organization. Or there is this evil genius, and this evil genius caused the war. No, it's not because of that. It's because of you. It's because you have lack of balance, you have loss of harmony, because you consider only a few variables. And you don't see the abundance of life, the abundance of your natural environment, the abundance of the community. This person is like this person is like that. Because we all have different life experiences that makes us different. And this difference, it's true diversity, not just based on your color or where you came from, but true diversity is based on different life experiences, organized differently, processed differently. And if you dare to see this diversity, this true diversity, then you're going to get more balance. You're going to get more harmony. Because in that minute, you understand that lack of balance is due to ignoring the abundance of life, ignoring the huge spectrum of possibilities in reality. Reality is not based on actuality. Actuality is a snapshot. Okay? Reality is based on possibilities. Reality is an infinite thing. Is based on possibilities that are themselves infinite. And so if you consider a lot of variables, if you dare to see the abundance in reality, then all your centralized, hierarchical, categoristic, mental atomic schemes are going to fall apart. And you understand that they are foolish. Okay? And they are the ones that cause you depression, not neurotransmitter problems, not chemical problems. Now, of course, genetics has a lot to do with it because life experience changes genetics and epigenetics. But nevertheless, a lot of it is not chemical. A chemical aspect is one aspect of the many aspects. But a lot of it is lack of balance. So, what do? We said that compensation is the response, a simplistic response to a complex problem. Okay, so you are lazy to think through a complex problem, so you instead use compensation. So in this case, because you are mentally disbalanced, because of your lack of perspective, your too narrow perspective, because you are a slave to your algorithms, okay, your predeterminations, you divert your attention to entertainment. Drugs, entertainment, virtual worlds, and virtual worlds. Okay? So this is all compensation. This is not a solution to the problem. This is a symptom, a set of symptoms of the problem. Okay? So the problem is not that you use a lot of antidepressants. The problem is not the virtual world. The problem is the need for these things because of mental inertia. Because people are too mentally inert to, instead of compensation, to think things through in using a local community, not only an individual perspective. You see, as a doctor, I'm trying to treat individuals, but I see that the problems are not individual at all. The problems are on a community level, on a very much higher level, and they are all coming from a wrong simplistic philosophy, and that philosophy is based on mental inertia, mental sloth. Okay? So, let's summarize all of this. The reality is that the human mind is not individually separate. So if it's not individually separate, then the mind cannot be simply linked to a physical organ. The human mind cannot be assigned to a finite time, like an individual lifetime. The human mind cannot be broken down to separate units and thought of as a physical object without consequences. it has consequences, it has compensations, it has quite major sacrilege. And if you think of reality as a physical reality, where small individual points, inert points, are making up that reality exclusively, then that is simply just a simplistic model, which needs to be transcended. But remember, even in physics, fields have no different boundaries. Fields are imagined to have small particles that make up those fields, but that may not be a sufficient model. Fields are more or less continuous, fields are very highly variable, and fields are boundless. Now, in terms of spirituality, it's even much more so. There are no inert, definite, discriminated points in reality. And your brain, your categories, your thought panels, your algorithms are based on these small, individual, inert, discriminated physical points. And they amount to a wrong, insufficient model, giving rise to a wrong, insufficient philosophy. And if you do not like philosophy, that doesn't save you, because you still have one. You are still very closely bound to one, and that philosophy that you are engaged in is insufficient, and it leads to very serious consequences. And those consequences we are going to talk about much more in detail in our future presentation, and we are also going to provide alternatives to these common thought patterns. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and goodbye for now.